Louisiana horror, feeding catfish with human flesh, and the chilling truth beneath Pond 3. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Have you ever wondered how far a person will go to hide a terrible secret, and how long that secret can stay buried before the truth rises to the surface? This story will take you deep into the heart of a quiet American town, where power, silence, and fear conspired to cover up a crime that still chills the soul. Stay with me until the end, because the lesson hidden beneath this tragedy is one we all need to remember. And before we begin, if you love true crime stories told with heart and meaning, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep these stories alive. On the outskirts of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the Mississippi River winds past wide stretches of farmland and catfish ponds that have fed families for generations. In late October of 2022, the air carried that heavy autumn stillness when the leaves turned copper and the nights grew longer, as if the land itself was holding its breath. It was during one of those restless nights that a young woman named Emily Carter vanished without a trace. Emily was only 23, a quiet, kind-hearted girl who had never truly lived for herself. She grew up in hardship. Her father, once strong from years of laboring in the sugarcane fields, had fallen ill. Her mother worked nights as a janitor at a local high school, stretching every paycheck to keep food on the table. Debt weighed on the Carter family like a stone, pushing them into the arms of the most powerful man in the parish, Harold Greene, the man people called the Catfish King of Louisiana. Harold was no ordinary farmer. He owned vast catfish farms stretching across the lowlands, ponds shimmering under the southern Sunday. His money reached into churches, schools, even local politics. To most, he was a generous benefactor, a man who never let his workers go hungry. But behind closed doors, Harold Greene ruled with a cold hand. His word was law, and his fortune gave him a mask that few dared to question. It was under his shadow that Emily's fate was sealed. Harold offered to pay off the Carters' debts, but there was a price. The price was Emily herself. She would marry his only son, Daniel Greene, who at the time was studying business overseas in London. The marriage was not born of love, but of desperation, a transaction dressed up in white lace and wedding vows. Emily became Daniel's wife, and by extension, Harold's possession. In the community, people whispered about the arrangement, but no one spoke too loudly. After all, Harold Greene's name carried weight, and mouths that dared to speak against him often found themselves silenced. Daniel's absence left Emily alone in the Greene family's sprawling estate, surrounded by acres of murky catfish ponds. On the surface, it was a life of comfort: polished floors, tall windows, and meals served on silver. But behind those walls, Emily lived in silence and fear. She was watched, always watched, by her father-in-law. Then came the night of her disappearance. No note, no phone call, no sign of a struggle. Only a darkened bedroom, a silence heavier than the autumn air, and the restless stirring of the catfish in pond number 3. A pond that, neighbors would later say, had grown oddly violent in those days. The question haunted the town: what really happened to Emily Carter? And could the whispers beneath the surface of those muddy waters hold the key to the truth? Before she carried the Greene name, Emily Carter was simply the eldest daughter of a struggling family on the edge of Baton Rouge. The Carters had always been steady folk, descendants of farmers who worked the land long before highways and subdivisions crept across Louisiana. But steady work doesn't always shield a family from hardship. Her father, George Carter, had been the kind of man neighbors respected: broad-shouldered, dependable, never one to turn down an honest day's labor. He cut cane in the summers, fixed fences in the winters, and kept a few head of cattle to stretch the family's income. But illness is a thief that comes without warning. By his mid-50s, George's health was failing. The sickness left him thin, often bedridden, and unable to keep up with the work that had once defined him. Her mother, Linda, took on double shifts cleaning classrooms and hallways at Jefferson High. Night after night she dragged herself home long after the town had gone quiet, smelling of disinfectant and carrying a paycheck that barely covered the light bill. Medical expenses piled higher than her wages. The mortgage slipped into arrears. Creditors began circling, their voices sharp and impatient. For Emily and her younger sister Rachel, the strain was everywhere in the unopened envelopes stacked on the kitchen counter, in the whispered arguments behind closed doors, in the way their mother's eyes never seemed to rest. By the summer of 2020, the Carters were in danger of losing not just their home but the fragile dignity they had clung to. It was in that moment of desperation that Harold Greene arrived. Harold had built his empire on acres of catfish ponds that sprawled across the lowlands outside Baton Rouge. His money touched every corner of the parish church donations, campaign contributions, scholarships with his name etched in gold letters. To most, he was a self-made man, generous and respectable. But people also knew better than to cross him. One evening he pulled into the Carters' gravel driveway in a gleaming pickup, stepping out with his practiced smile. "I hear y'all are having some trouble," he said, his voice smooth as molasses. "You know I've always looked out for this family." Linda nearly wept with relief as he laid out his offer. He would pay the mortgage, clear the medical bills, make sure George had the best doctors, even see that Rachel stayed in school. For a family drowning in debt, his words felt like a lifeline. But there was a catch. "In return," Harold said carefully, "I believe Emily would be a fine wife for my boy Daniel. He's studying in London, but when he comes back, he'll need someone steady by his side. This would bring our families together." The room went silent. George shifted in his chair, shame etched deep in the lines of his face. Linda's hands clutched her apron, as though she could hold on to her pride with her fingers alone. And Emily, standing in the doorway, felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had seen Daniel only in passing before he left for London. He was polite, distant, the sort of young man who lived in books and lectures rather than in Baton Rouge soil. He was a stranger, and now she was being asked no, expected to bind her life to his. Linda tried to protest. She told Harold that Emily was still young, that the family would find another way. But her voice faltered against the weight of his gaze. He pressed gently, almost kindly, but with the certainty of a man who was not used to hearing no. "Hey." That night, Emily lay awake listening to her mother weep. Linda told her she didn't have to do it, that no debt was worth her happiness. Yet both women knew the truth. Without Harold's money, George's medicine would run out, the house would be lost, and Rachel's future would crumble. So Emily agreed. The wedding came quickly, dressed up as joy, though it was duty that led her down the aisle. Along the banks of the Mississippi, under a soft autumn sky, she wore a white gown borrowed from a cousin and carried a bouquet of gardenias. Guests clapped, music played, and Harold stood at the front, his smile wide and triumphant. Daniel sent a video call from London, offering polite congratulations. His absence was excused as the mark of a promising future abroad. To outsiders, it seemed like a storybook match. A poor girl lifted into wealth, a family saved by marriage. But behind Emily's calm face was resignation. That night, after the guests had gone and the music faded, she cried quietly into her pillow. She had not married out of love, but out of necessity. Her vows were chains, and her new family's fortune was her cage. In the weeks that followed, the Carters' debts disappeared, and the Greene estate became Emily's home. Yet she felt no freedom. Daniel remained in London, sending brief calls across the ocean, while Harold's presence filled every corner of the mansion. Neighbors whispered that Emily was lucky, that she had been chosen. But Rachel noticed the truth in her sister's eyes. Emily was fading. She smiled less, spoke softly, and carried a weight no one else could see. And when Harold's gaze lingered too long, Emily knew her family's rescue had come at a price far greater than debt. The Greene estate stood at the edge of Baton Rouge like a monument to wealth and control, the mansion with its tall white columns and sweeping porch looking out over acres of water where catfish swirled beneath the muddy surface. And while neighbors saw it as the pride of Harold Greene's empire, Emily felt it as a house too large, too quiet, and too filled with shadows. With Daniel away in London, the silence pressed down on her. Hallways seemed endless, and the polished floors echoed with her steps, and at night the low croak of frogs and the restless splashing from the ponds reminded her just how far she was from the noisy comfort of her childhood home, where her mother hummed in the kitchen, her father coughed from the bedroom, and Rachel chattered about school, a home crowded but alive, unlike this mansion where silence carried a different weight. Harold filled that silence with his presence, at first cloaking it in gestures that seemed harmless, as he appeared at breakfast pouring her coffee before she could reach for the pot, asking about her day, her sleep, the servants, offering kindness with eyes that lingered too long, eyes that measured her like something already belonging to him. Emily tried to vanish into small routines, mornings in the garden trimming roses even as autumn winds stripped them bare, afternoons in the library letting the dust of forgotten books settle around her like a shield, evenings on the porch swing writing letters to Daniel she rarely mailed. And when he called, she clung to his voice, trying to share her loneliness without burdening him. But across an ocean her words felt lighter, smaller, until they sounded like worries he could brush aside. Weeks stretched into months, and Harold's mask slipped, his nearness growing heavier. In the kitchen reaching over her shoulder for a glass when there was no need, in the hallway letting his hand brush her back, his compliments thick and unsettling. Once smiling too wide as he said, "Daniel's fortunate. Not every man finds a wife so radiant." Emily forced a laugh and walked away, but his eyes followed, and at night she dreaded the sound of footsteps in the hall, sometimes pausing outside her door before retreating, leaving her clutching the sheets, praying he would not knock. She thought of telling her mother or Rachel, yet what comfort could they offer? Since Harold had paid for George's medicine, saved the house, and kept Rachel in school, and to accuse him would drag them back into debt, or worse, while even the men who worked the ponds kept their distance, men like Tommy Alvarez who nodded politely but lowered his eyes, tied to their own families and unwilling to risk Harold's wrath. The ponds became Emily's refuge, their edges marked by the wind tugging at her hair, the water rippling with sudden splashes as the fish broke the surface, and in the fading light when the sky turned orange and purple she felt alone at last, though even then the ponds seemed restless, holding secrets they could not speak. Rachel visited when she could, filling the house with laughter, and one afternoon on the porch swing she asked gently, "Are you happy here?" To which Emily gave a faint smile and said, "It's quiet, that's all." But Rachel pressed, "You don't look happy." And Emily squeezed her sister's hand, whispering, "Don't worry about me. Just focus on school." Words that tasted bitter even as she said them. One evening, Emily was in the library dusting shelves when Harold entered with a glass of bourbon, the smell heavy in the air, and he leaned against the doorframe watching her until she turned, saying slowly, "You remind me of your mother, strong, but prettier." She froze, muttered an excuse, and hurried past, his chuckle trailing her like poison, and that night she cried into her pillow, silent tears soaking the sheets, realizing she had given up freedom to save her family and now understood the true cost, that the Greene estate was not only a quiet house but a cage, and Harold Greene was the one holding the key. By the first chill of winter, she no longer mistook his gestures for kindness, feeling his intentions in every look, every word, every lingering pause outside her door, living each day with the knowledge that he was circling closer and that no one, not even her husband across the ocean, could shield her from him. Harold Greene lived with two faces, one polished for the world and one he revealed only inside the walls of his estate. And the people of Baton Rouge knew only the polished face, the one that smiled generously at church suppers, pressed bills into the hands of charity drives, and gave speeches about hard work and community, while neighbors called him the Catfish King of Louisiana and praised him as a benefactor. Yet to Emily the mask was paper thin, for when the guests left and the doors closed, Harold's eyes told the truth, eyes that lingered too long, eyes that spoke not of fatherly concern but of hunger. In public, he was the picture of generosity, handing out scholarships, paying for renovations at the local parish, greeting politicians like an equal. And when he walked through town, people tipped their hats and nodded as though they were standing before a man touched by luck and virtue. But in private, his shadow stretched across Emily's life, with a weight she could not escape. His voice soft but heavy, his presence constant, and each day she understood more clearly that the kindness the community adored was only a costume. As autumn faded into the gray chill of winter, Harold's advances grew bolder, no longer hidden behind polite words or chance touches, but deliberate and pressing, his hand brushing her back in the hallway, his body leaning too close in the kitchen, his gifts appearing on her dresser, necklaces and scarves she had never asked for and never touched, each one a silent claim. One evening, while she set the dining table, he appeared with a bottle of wine, pouring her a glass before she could protest, lifting his own in a toast and saying, "To family, to the ties that bind us." And though she sipped only to keep the peace, the wine burned her throat, and his eyes measured every swallow as though he were counting how close she was to surrender. She tried to outpace him by shaping her days around his routines, rising early to eat breakfast before he stirred, slipping into the garden when he was away, or walking the edges of the ponds when the workers were near enough to see her, yet no routine kept him fully at bay, for his footsteps still echoed in the hallways, and at night she still heard him pause outside her door, the knob rattling once before the silence returned, and she lay stiff in bed with her hands clenched, praying he would not enter. Letters to Daniel piled in her drawer, unsent, pages heavy with words she could not speak aloud, and when he called across the ocean she tried to pour her fears into the space between them, but his replies were gentle dismissals, promises to come home soon, reassurances she could not hold in her hands, and she ended each call with the phone pressed to her chest, and tears she wiped away before anyone could see. The workers on the farm looked on from a distance, Tommy Alvarez among them, his eyes carrying pity but his lips sealed. For Harold had fed their families for decades, and no one would risk their living to challenge him, and Emily knew even before she asked that no one here could save her. Rachel's visits became the only light in her days, her younger sister bringing laughter and warmth into the house, sensing the heaviness that Emily never confessed, and once on the porch swing Rachel whispered, "You look like you're being erased," words that struck Emily like a truth she could not deny, yet she only smiled weakly and told her sister to focus on school, swallowing the bitterness of the lie because speaking the truth felt like calling down a storm that might destroy them both. By December, Harold no longer pretended patience, cornering her in the hallway with his hand braced against the wall, smiling as he said, "You don't have to be lonely here, Emily. I can take care of you better than anyone." And though she shoved past him and fled to her room, his chuckle followed her down the corridor, curling into her ears long after she had locked the door and pressed her back against it, heart pounding. That night she cried silently, realizing that the world saw him as a savior while she lived with the predator hidden beneath, and she understood now with aching clarity that no neighbor would believe her, no pastor would condemn him, not when his money built their schools and kept their churches lit, and so she was alone, trapped in a house that looked like fortune but felt like a cage. As winter deepened and the wind swept cold across the Catfish ponds, Emily knew time was working against her, each night bringing Harold closer to the moment when he would no longer linger outside her door, but step through it without hesitation, and she began to realize she would need more than silence to survive. January settled over Louisiana with a gray sky and a sharp wind sweeping across the Catfish ponds, and inside the Greene estate, Emily felt fear changing its shape, no longer the silent dread that had kept her paralyzed, but something closer to resolve, a quiet voice telling her she needed to leave behind proof if the worst ever came, because she could not trust Harold to stop, nor the community to believe her word against his, and so she began to search for a way to protect herself. She had grown up in a family that survived by making do, her mother stretching groceries until they seemed to multiply, and her father fixing broken tools with scraps of wire, and she carried that same resourcefulness now as she combed through drawers and cabinets until, in Daniel's study, she found a small camera no larger than her hand, a device tucked away with old chargers and forgotten receipts. And when she tested it, pointing it at the mirror and whispering her own name into the still air, her heart pounded as she replayed the clip and saw her own frightened face staring back, proof that the lens worked, proof that she could make the truth visible. She hid it inside the clock on her nightstand where a thin crack in the wood let the lens see without being seen, and each night she wound the clock with shaking fingers, whispering to herself that if Harold forced his way into her room, the world would know, that she would not vanish into silence without leaving a trace. Harold, meanwhile, seemed to sense her distance, his behavior slipping further from pretense, and he grew restless in the mansion, sending away servants early with thin excuses, leaving Emily alone with him in hallways that seemed to stretch forever, his voice warm but his eyes cold. He offered her drinks she did not want, laughing when she refused, but the laugh was sharp, carrying more threat than humor, and when she ignored the gifts he left at her door, silk scarves, perfumes, jewelry heavy with his money but empty of affection, he began to speak with an edge, saying once as he blocked her way in the corridor, "You think you're too good for kindness?" And though her throat closed with fear, she lowered her eyes and slipped past him in silence, knowing any reply would feed the darkness in him. Rachel remained her only comfort, visiting whenever she could, bringing with her the warmth of home and the honesty of someone who saw more than words confessed. And one afternoon, as they sat together on the porch swing, Rachel whispered, "Something's wrong. I can feel it. Please tell me." But Emily only smiled faintly, squeezing her sister's hand and saying, "Don't worry about me. Just promise me if anything happens you'll believe me." Words that left Rachel staring in confusion and worry, while Emily turned her gaze to the ponds, unwilling to explain more, unwilling to risk drawing her sister into Harold's shadow. At night, Emily lay awake as wind rattled the shutters and the waters of the pond slapped against the banks, her pulse racing when Harold's footsteps lingered outside her door, sometimes rattling the knob before fading back into silence. And she pressed her palms together under the covers, praying he would not enter yet, knowing deep down that patience was running thin. Daniel's calls across the ocean gave her no strength, his voice distracted with studies, his reassurances repeated like lines from a book. "Be patient, Em. I'll be home soon. Just hold on." And though she longed to scream the truth, she swallowed it back, hanging up each time with tears she wiped away before anyone could see. The Greene estate played host to Harold's double life each day, the public man and the private predator woven together. For in the mornings he greeted buyers at the ponds, clasping hands with the same smile that charmed the parish, and in the evenings he prowled the mansion with heavy steps, a king outside but a hunter inside, and the workers who noticed the unease in Emily's eyes looked away. Tommy Alvarez among them, guilt tightening in his chest, even as silence bound his tongue, for Harold's money fed their families, and his power made courage costly. Emily's world shrank into three fragile sanctuaries: the bedroom, where her hidden camera ticked inside the clock, the porch swing where she whispered half-truths to her sister, and the garden where roses clung stubbornly to their stems against the cold wind. And even in those places, she felt the walls closing in, the certainty growing sharper with each day that Harold was circling closer, that he would not be content to linger outside her door forever. By the last week of January, she felt the air itself change, heavy with expectation, and as she wound the clock once more, the camera inside humming quietly like a secret heartbeat, she whispered into the empty room, "If he comes, let this be enough." And her words sank into the silence like a prayer, a vow, and a warning all at once. The night it happened carried a storm heavy with rain and the smell of wet earth drifting from the Catfish ponds, the Greene estate standing in silence except for the wind pressing against its windows, and Emily sat on her bed winding the clock, the tiny camera hidden inside ticking like a second heartbeat, her hands trembling because she felt what the air already knew, that this was the night patience would end. Harold's footsteps had grown heavier through the evening, his voice earlier thick with bourbon when he passed her in the kitchen. And now those steps stopped outside her door with a pause, so long she thought the house itself was holding its breath, the knob rattling once, then harder, before the door cracked open and Harold filled the frame, his shoulders blotting out the hall light, his eyes glazed from drink yet burning with intent. He stepped in slowly, closing the door behind him with a sound that felt like a sentence, saying her name in a voice meant to sound gentle but soaked in possession, and Emily rose with fear burning through her chest, holding her hands up and whispering, "Don't come closer, Harold. I'll tell Daniel. I'll tell everyone." Words sharp and shaking, but he only smiled bitterly and answered, "No one will believe you over me." She backed into the corner, desperation clawing its way into her voice as she shouted, "I have proof, I swear I do, and if you touch me they'll see it." And for a flicker his smile faltered, his eyes narrowing at the mention of evidence. But the flicker died into rage, and he moved fast, seizing her wrist with a grip that crushed her bone, dragging her down as she screamed. Her cries filled the room, her voice breaking as she called Daniel's name, a plea that rose above the storm outside yet reached no ears but his, and Harold's fury fed on it, his hand pressing hard over her mouth, his breath sour with liquor, his weight pushing against her as she kicked and clawed, fighting with the raw strength of terror. The nightstand rocked, the clock rattled but held its place, the camera inside capturing the blur of shadows and movement, the truth playing out in grainy silence that would one day shatter Harold's mask. Emily's eyes shone with both fear and defiance, her body refusing to surrender even as his power bore down, and each scratch, each muffled cry was a refusal to vanish quietly. But her strength was no match for his, and slowly her fight weakened, her body slackening beneath his hand until her stillness filled the room, her open eyes fixed on him as though they asked the question he could never answer. Why her? Why silence? Why this cage dressed as salvation? Harold staggered back, panting, staring at her motionless form, and for a long moment he stood frozen, sweat on his brow, his chest heaving, the mask of the generous Catfish king shattered and replaced by the raw face of a man who had taken what could never be undone. His hands shook as he muttered to himself, denial already forming, plans already spinning, and when the storm rattled the windows he lifted his gaze as though the noise itself accused him, his mind clawing for control, whispering that power and money could still bury this night. He pulled the sheet from the bed, wrapping her with rough movements, dragging her toward the back hall where the shed waited. The machine he had used for years to grind food for fish now looming like a sentence, and beyond the shed lay Pond 3, the black water restless, as if it sensed what was coming. No one in the house stirred, no servant nearby, no neighbor close enough to hear over the storm, and Harold told himself this silence was protection, that the community loved him too much to question, that Emily's voice would vanish like the others he had silenced with money and fear. Yet behind him the clock ticked, steady and relentless, the lens still open, still recording, still remembering, and though Harold did not know it, Emily's final act of defiance was alive inside that clock, the one witness he could not silence, waiting for the day when its truth would rise to the surface, like something pulled from the depths of the muddy pond. The storm had softened into a drizzle by the time Harold dragged the sheet-wrapped body across the yard, his boots sinking into the wet ground as he pulled her toward the shed, his breath ragged and his mind no longer dwelling on what he had done but racing to how he would hide it, because Harold Greene had spent a lifetime burying mistakes under layers of money and charm, and he told himself this would be no different. The shed reeked of oil and damp wood, the grinder inside looming like some iron beast, the same machine that had ground meat for fish feed countless times before, and as he shoved Emily's body onto the floor, his hands trembled but his jaw set firm, muttering to himself that no one would ever know that she was gone, that he still had control. He started the grinder and its roar drowned the rain, his movements sharp, brutal, and when the work was done he hauled the remnants to Pond 3, the pond closest to the shed, the one shielded from view by tall reeds. The water there was dark and restless, under the glow of the single yard light, and when he tipped his burden in the surface, broke into violent ripples as the fish swarmed, silver flashes breaking the blackness, thrashing with a hunger that made his stomach turn, and he whispered into the night, "It's finished," though the pond seemed to churn harder as if it mocked him, as if the water itself refused to keep his secret. By morning he had scrubbed his hands raw, shaved, and put on a pressed shirt, forcing himself into the role the parish knew well, the grieving father-in-law bewildered by a young woman's disappearance. He was the one to call the police, his voice steady with just enough sorrow, telling them Emily had vanished in the night, that perhaps she had run away, lonely with Daniel so far away. When officers arrived, he welcomed them at the door, his eyes rimmed red, his handkerchief damp, guiding them through the spotless house, pointing out an empty closet where he had removed a few clothes to make it seem she had packed, showing them fragments of text messages on her phone that he had planted, lines twisted to suggest longing for another life, and the officers listened politely, their pens scratching, none of them daring to look too closely at the man who had funded their charity drives and stood beside their chief at ribbon cuttings. Neighbors arrived with casseroles and condolences, whispering their theories as they shook Harold's hand, some saying it was sad but predictable, a young wife left behind while her husband studied overseas, others saying perhaps she had grown tired of wealth without companionship, and Harold played the part to perfection, sitting on the porch with his head bowed, his voice catching as he said he had loved Emily like a daughter, that he only prayed she was safe. On Sunday he stood at the front pew of the church, shoulders slumped, tears sliding down his cheeks as the pastor prayed for Emily's return, and the congregation looked at him with pity, with trust, with reverence, seeing nothing but a man broken by loss. But Rachel did not believe. Her grief sharpened into suspicion, and she told anyone who would listen that her sister would never run away, not without telling her, not leaving their mother alone, her voice cracking with anger as she repeated it until people turned away, dismissing her as a girl blinded by sorrow, yet her words planted seeds of unease. On the farm, Tommy Alvarez noticed Pond 3 more than anything else, the way the fish churned the water with frantic hunger, feeding as though possessed, growing thick in a matter of days. And though he said nothing to the sheriff, he muttered to himself in the barns, shaking his head, feeling the weight of something unnatural pressing on his chest. Harold, however, trusted the mask he wore, confident that silence would hold as it always had, that money and reputation would shield him, that Emily's story would fade into rumor and pity. He sat at his desk in the evenings, reading reports, answering calls, carrying on as though nothing had shifted, yet somewhere in the back of his mind a shadow pressed, for upstairs the clock on Emily's nightstand still ticked, its hidden eyes still open, capturing the night he believed buried, waiting with the patience of time itself, and though Harold could not hear it, the truth was there, steady and certain, biding the day it would rise from silence like a body surfacing through the muddy waters of Pond 3. Detective Michael Lawson had carried a badge in Baton Rouge for more than 20 years, his hair graying at the edges, his eyes trained by experience to catch the tremor in a lie, and when the call came about a missing woman from the Greene estate, he drove out himself. Not because missing persons were rare, but because the name Greene carried weight in every corner of the parish. He found Harold waiting on the porch, shoulders slumped, handkerchief in hand, his words careful as he spoke of Emily's sudden disappearance, suggesting she had been lonely, perhaps restless with Daniel away overseas, and Lawson listened without interruption, nodding slightly but filing each phrase away, the cadence of a story rehearsed too many times. Inside the mansion, the detective let his gaze travel the rooms, noting the closet too neatly arranged, the bed too perfectly smoothed, the phone with messages that read like fragments meant for an audience, and though nothing stood out as broken or violent, the neatness itself pulled at his instincts, a kind of cleanliness that felt staged. He stepped outside again, the winter air damp on his face as he walked toward the ponds, the expanse of water stretching wide and gray under the weak morning sun, each one numbered with weathered signs. Workers moved quietly along the banks, tipping their caps when they saw him, but their eyes shifted away quickly, the look of men who knew more than they dared to say. At Pond 3, Lawson paused, watching the surface break again and again as fish surged upward, snapping at feed with an aggression that made the water foam, and he frowned, murmuring, "Strange," half to himself, until a low voice behind him added, "They've been like that lately, sir. Like they can't ever get enough." It was Tommy Alvarez, his cap low, his shoulders bent as if bracing against more than the cold, and though he said nothing further, the words hung in the air like a thread Lawson could not ignore. Back at his office that night, Lawson spread the case file across his desk, listening as younger officers repeated Harold's version. A restless young wife, a missing suitcase, a few suggestive texts. They spoke of it as if the matter were nearly closed, but Lawson shook his head slowly, telling them absence itself was evidence, that sometimes the cleanest scenes hid the dirtiest truths. He lit a cigarette, staring at Emily's photograph that Rachel had pressed into his hand earlier that day, her young face caught in a moment of stillness, eyes serious, almost pleading, and he felt the familiar pull of a case that would not let him sleep. Rachel's voice still rang in his ears, fierce and unyielding, as she insisted her sister would never run away, not without a word, not leaving their mother, and Lawson believed her, not because of sentiment, but because grief, that raw could not be faked. He promised nothing, but he told her quietly that he would not dismiss her like the others had, and she left with tears in her eyes but a spark of hope on her face. Over the next week, Lawson returned to the Greene property unannounced, walking the grounds again and again, speaking with workers who gave him little, circling back to Pond 3 each time, drawn to the way the water churned too violently, the fish breaking the surface with a hunger he had not seen before. He asked Harold about the cameras on the property, and Harold gave a smooth answer, saying lightning had struck them weeks earlier, leaving them useless. A story Lawson nodded at but tucked away as too convenient. Each piece by itself was nothing, but together the threads began to weave, a picture forming that smelled of something far darker than a runaway bride. Meanwhile, Harold moved through town wearing his mask without a slip, speaking softly in church, shaking hands at the market, standing in his pew with tears sliding down his cheeks as the pastor prayed for Emily's return, and neighbors whispered sympathy, repeating his story as though it were fact. But Lawson kept his distance, watching the man with eyes that did not blink, listening for the cracks in a voice that carried too much polish, waiting for the moment when the mask would falter. The detective knew cases like this unraveled slowly, that power and reputation built thick walls, but his instincts told him the walls here were thinner than they appeared, that somewhere beneath the calm surface of Pond 3 lay the weight of truth, and he resolved that he would not let the water keep its secret. For now there was no body, no blood, no confession, but there was hunger in the fish, fear in the worker's eyes, and certainty in his gut. And Lawson had learned long ago that gut was never to be ignored. Detective Michael Lawson returned to the Greene estate on a cold morning, when mist clung low over the fields and the air smelled of damp soil, his eyes fixed on Pond 3, as though it had been calling him back since the first day he saw it. He had spent too many years chasing truth to ignore his instincts, and something about the frenzy of those fish refused to leave his mind. He ordered the workers to halt all feedings, his tone firm, leaving no room for hesitation, and though they shifted uneasily, aware that Harold Greene would not approve, they obeyed the detective's command. Buckets of grain were set aside, deputies were posted at the water's edge, and the pond was left to its silence. At first the fish circled beneath the surface, their movements sharp but controlled, yet by the second day the water boiled with violence, bodies colliding as they snapped at one another, tearing fins and flesh, their hunger so wild it turned the pond white with foam. Deputies kept careful notes, their disbelief plain on their faces, and when Lawson arrived to witness it himself, he stood with his hands behind his back, his jaw tightening as he murmured, "They've learned a different appetite." The words were quiet, but the men around him understood he was not speaking of feed or grain. Later that afternoon, Harold walked down from the mansion, his face set in the practiced expression of grief, and when he saw the deputies stationed at Pond 3, a flicker crossed his features before he forced it away. He asked Lawson in a voice that tried for courtesy why the police were interfering with the farm, why they stood guard over water, and Lawson only replied, "Routine observation, nothing to trouble yourself with," his calm tone a blade sharper than open accusation. Harold's mouth tightened, but he said nothing more, retreating to the house with his shoulders stiff, every step heavy with the effort of control. Among the workers the whispers began to spread, carried from barn to fence line, spoken in low voices when they were certain no one else was near. Something was wrong with the pond, they said, something that had not been seen in all the years of feeding fish, and no gift from Harold, no bonus or raise, could make them feel otherwise. Tommy Alvarez, who had seen more seasons on the farm than anyone, muttered one evening to Lawson that Pond 3 had never been like this, that the fish were feeding like beasts starved of something they could not name, and though his voice shook, the truth in it was clear. Lawson placed a steady hand on his shoulder, told him he had done enough, and let the weight of the man's words settle into his notes. Rachel came to the estate often, her eyes haunted, her voice raw from grief, clinging to Lawson with a hope she dared not lose. She asked again and again if he believed her sister could still be near, if he believed the story Harold told was a lie. And Lawson, though careful not to promise, told her that truth had a way of rising, that silence could not bury it forever. She held on to those words as though they were the last rope keeping her from drowning. By the end of the week the fish were savage, leaping so hard against the wooden docks that one deputy flinched back, the sound of bodies striking the planks echoing like fists on a door. "They act like they've tasted blood," the deputy whispered, and though Lawson gave no reply, his silence carried more weight than an answer could. That night he sat alone in his office, Emily's photo before him, her eyes serious, almost knowing, and he stared at it until dawn, the conviction inside him no longer just suspicion but certainty. The Greene estate still hummed with Harold's performance. the grieving patriarch, the man bowed by tragedy, his mask never slipping in town, at church, or in the company of neighbors who offered sympathy. But for Lawson, the mask had already cracked. He saw the flicker in Harold's expression when Pond 3 was mentioned, the unease he tried to bury, and the detective knew the truth was close, closer than Harold dared to imagine. There was no body, no blood, no confession, yet there were fish in a frenzy, workers afraid to speak, and a sister who refused to be silenced. And Lawson had learned long ago that these were the pieces that broke cases open. He resolved that the next step would be inside the house itself, in the quiet spaces Emily had called her own, because if she had sensed what was coming, she would not have left the world without leaving a trace. Detective Michael Lawson returned to the Greene estate on a pale morning when the house looked less like a mansion and more like a hollow shell, and he informed Harold that another search would be conducted, routine procedure, nothing to trouble an innocent man. Harold forced a weary smile, his voice thick with practiced sorrow, but his eyes followed Lawson with the stiffness of someone bracing for a blow. The team spread through the house methodically, gloves on, scanners in hand, their movements deliberate, not just looking for what could be seen but for what might have been hidden where ordinary eyes would fail. Lawson stood for a long moment in the doorway of the bedroom that had belonged to Emily, a room once searched and declared clean, and he let the silence wash over him, studying the corners, the too-tight bedspread, the faint scuff along the floor where something had been dragged. His men swept the walls, checked outlets, scanned for electronics, and one paused at the nightstand, fingers pressing along a warped edge of wood until a panel gave way, revealing the small shape of a camera no larger than a fist, its tiny lens staring back like an unblinking eye. Lawson's chest tightened, though his face stayed steady as he slipped the device into an evidence bag, his voice calm as he ordered the team to continue, every step measured. He carried the bag past Harold, who sat at the kitchen table with a handkerchief clenched in his hand, and when Harold asked what they had found, Lawson answered only, "Routine," before walking on, but the way Harold's knuckles whitened betrayed the fear he fought to hide. Back at the station, Lawson gathered his men in the dim conference room, blinds drawn, the air weighted with expectation. The technician slid the memory card into the computer. The screen flickered, static at first, then the grainy outline of Emily sitting on her bed, her hands clasped tight, her face pale with fear. For a moment she just sat there listening to the silence, and then came the sound of a knock, the creak of hinges, Harold's voice thick with drink, the shadow crossing the room, the struggle that followed. They watched as Emily screamed, her body fighting, the nightstand shuddering but the lens holding steady, catching every movement, every sound, until at last the room fell still, and her body lay motionless beneath him. When the screen went black, no one in the room spoke. Even the youngest officers, men hardened by violent crime scenes, bowed their heads as though in the presence of something sacred. Lawson sat motionless, his jaw locked, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white, and after a long silence he whispered, "She knew. She left this for us." The footage was copied, logged, and sealed, guarded with the care of a final testimony. And the next morning Lawson drove back to the Greene estate with a warrant folded in his pocket and the calm certainty of a man who carried truth in his hands. Harold answered the door with his same mask of grief, the soft voice, the lowered eyes. But when Lawson stepped inside with officers at his back and laid the warrant on the polished table, the mask faltered. He asked in a brittle voice what this was about, and Lawson gave no speech, no accusation, only placed the evidence bag on the table, the camera inside resting like an eye that had never closed. Harold's lips parted, his breath catching, his gaze darting between the bag and the faces around him, searching for escape where there was none. And in that silence, the role he had played for weeks collapsed, the mask crumbling until all that remained was a man cornered by the truth his power could not bury. The courthouse in Baton Rouge overflowed long before the hearing began, every bench crowded with workers from the ponds, neighbors from town, church members, and reporters eager to see if the whispers that had spread for weeks could possibly be true. Harold Greene entered wearing a press suit, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted, the picture of a man still clinging to the belief that wealth and reputation might save him. He sat at the defense table with his hands clenched tight in his lap, his face carefully arranged into sorrow. Detective Lawson took his place quietly in the back, his eyes never leaving the small evidence bag on the judge's bench, the camera that had waited in silence until now. Rachel sat near the front, her hand gripping her mother's so hard that both their knuckles were white, her gaze fixed on the man who had destroyed her sister. The judge called the room to order. Voices fell silent, and the prosecutor rose to read the charges: murder, destruction of evidence, concealment of a body, words heavy enough to still even the rustle of papers. Harold's attorney stood quickly, his voice polished, insisting there was no body, no direct proof, only grief twisted into suspicion. And for a moment the crowd shifted uneasily, reminded of the very doubts Harold had counted on. But then the prosecutor requested that the evidence be shown, the lights dimmed, and the screen at the front of the room flickered to life. At first only static, then the grainy view from the clock's hidden lens appeared. Emily sitting on her bed, her hands clasped, her face pale with dread. A murmur rippled through the crowd, then the door opened, Harold's voice slurred by drink, the shadow stepping inside. What followed froze the room. Emily's desperate pleas, her body thrashing, the nightstand shuddering but the camera steady. The sound of her cries muffled beneath his hand until at last she fell still, her eyes wide, accusing even in death. When the screen went black, no one moved. A woman in the gallery sobbed, men bowed their heads. Even the judge sat in silence longer than the gavel allowed. Harold's face drained of color, his mask collapsing, his mouth opening and closing without words. His lawyer stammered objections that died in the heavy air, because nothing could erase what all had just seen. Rachel broke down, her body shaking as she buried her face against her mother's shoulder, her grief raw yet edged with vindication. Her sister was no runaway, no restless young wife, but a victim whose courage had left behind the truth. The workers who had labored for Harold shifted in their seats, shame pressing against their silence, remembering the uneasy glances, the things they had suspected but never dared to speak. The neighbors who had accepted his donations, the church members who had praised his generosity, all sat pale and still, realizing they had bowed to a mask while the monster hid in plain sight. The judge struck his gavel hard, calling the court to order, and instructed Harold to rise. His voice cracked as he tried to speak, his lips fumbling through denials, excuses, claims of being framed, but the video had spoken louder than he ever could, and at last his words withered into silence. He stood hunched, his hands trembling, a man undone not by rumor but by the truth he could not bury. Lawson watched, not with triumph, but with the steady calm of a man who had promised a grieving sister that truth would rise, and now it had. When the hearing closed and Harold was led away in chains, the courthouse spilled out into the street, voices buzzing, some furious, some grieving, all of them carrying the weight of a shattered illusion. Rachel stood on the steps, tears on her cheeks, her face lifted to the gray sky as she whispered that Emily had not been silenced, that her sister had spoken through the only voice left to her. Lawson stepped beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, and said softly, "She left this for us, and because of her, he will never hide again." Rachel nodded through her tears, and for the first time since Emily's disappearance, she felt a glimmer of peace, fragile, trembling, but real. The cell that held Harold Greene was no larger than a tool shed. 4 concrete walls, a cot with a thin blanket, a sink stained from rust, and a narrow slit of a window that let in more cold than light. The man who once walked Baton Rouge in press suits and polished shoes, shaking hands on courthouse steps and smiling from church pews, now shuffled in gray prison clothes, his hair unkempt, his shoulders bent under the weight of silence. The name Catfish King carried no weight here. Guards passed him without a glance, and other inmates cared nothing for the wealth or power he once wielded. At night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the lights in his ears, the shouts from distant cells echoing like ghosts, and no matter how hard he pressed his hands over them, he still heard Emily's voice, her cries, her defiance, the silence that followed. Outside the prison walls, the world he had built crumbled fast. His farms were seized, the ponds auctioned off to pay debts and legal costs, the mansion stripped of its furniture and left standing like a hollow monument to greed. Neighbors who once sought his favor now spoke his name with disgust, ashamed of how long they had bowed to his mask. At church his absence was a shadow, the donations that once filled plates remembered now as blood money, and the parish that had once honored him as a benefactor spat his name as a curse. Rachel returned often to the small house where she and Emily had grown up, helping their mother with chores, keeping her company through the long evenings when grief pressed hardest. Their mother moved slowly, her body bent not only from years of labor but from sorrow that weighed more heavily than age. She often sat with Emily's photograph in her lap, her lips moving in prayer, her fingers tracing the glass as though she could touch her daughter through it. Rachel tried to be strong, speaking of her classes, of the future, but each night alone she cried into her pillow, guilt gnawing that she had not done more, that she had not spoken louder, though she knew in her heart Emily had carried a burden no one else could. Detective Lawson visited from time to time, not as an officer but as a man who understood scars. He drank coffee at their kitchen table, his voice low, steady, telling them the process would be long but justice would hold, reminding Rachel that Emily had not been silenced, that her choice to leave behind proof had broken the mask Harold wore. His words did not erase grief, but they steadied her like a hand on her back, a reminder that her sister's voice had changed more than just their lives, it had forced an entire community to see. Around the parish the story lingered like a scar that refused to fade. People spoke of it in quiet corners, not only of Harold's crime, but of the silence that had shielded him for so long. Workers remembered the times they had looked away. Neighbors thought of the evenings when Emily's eyes seemed heavy with secrets. Church members recalled the donations they had accepted without question. Shame lay thick across them all, but with it came a fragile vow that silence would not be chosen so easily again. Emily's name became more than a memory. It became a warning, a call to listen, a reminder that one small act of defiance could cut through power and lies. In his cell, Harold sat with his back to the wall, staring at the strip of gray light that fell through the window. He replayed the trial in his mind again and again, the faces in the courtroom, the gasps when the video played, Rachel's tears, Lawson's steady gaze, and he muttered excuses into the air, insisting he had been framed, misunderstood, betrayed. But even he no longer believed them. The weight of his sentence pressed heavier with each passing day, heavier than the chains, heavier than the silence. And for the first time in his life, Harold Greene understood that there were limits money could not cross, masks that could not be worn forever, truths too strong to be buried. And so the parish carried on with a wound it would never fully heal, Emily's family holding to one another, Harold waiting in his cell for the justice he could not escape, and in the echo of it all remained the steady tick of a clock, the sound of a camera that had refused to close its eye, the sound of a young woman's courage that had turned silence into justice. The final sentencing came on a bright spring morning in Baton Rouge, the courthouse steps crowded long before the doors opened. Reporters jostled with cameras, workers from the pond stood in their worn boots, and neighbors filled the sidewalks, all waiting for the conclusion of a story that had haunted their parish for months. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation, the shuffle of feet and hushed voices carrying through the hall. At the defense table, Harold Greene sat in his prison uniform, thinner than before, his hair gone gray at the edges, his hands clenched together as if he could still hold on to some shred of control. He stared straight ahead, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The judge entered, the gavel struck, and silence fell over the courtroom. The prosecutor spoke first, his voice firm, reminding the court that the evidence had already spoken with undeniable clarity. The hidden video, the violent frenzy of Pond 3, the years of silence Harold had bought with fear and money. Each detail painted the picture of not only a murder, but a deception that had poisoned an entire community. Harold's attorney rose for one last defense, his words practiced, insisting there was no body, that the court was condemning a man on suspicion alone, but the voice lacked conviction. Even he seemed to hear the hollowness of his argument echo in the still air. Then the judge leaned forward, his voice solemn, recounting Harold's life of power and pretense, the mask of generosity that had shielded him, the silence that had allowed him to harm with impunity. He spoke Emily Carter's name clearly, reminding the court that her courage in leaving behind proof had stripped away every lie. The courtroom sat still, each person holding their breath as the words came. Death by lethal injection, to be carried out by the state of Louisiana. The sound rippled through the room, gasps, muffled sobs, heads bowed in prayer. Rachel clutched her mother's hand, tears streaming, not in triumph but in aching relief, the knowledge that Emily's suffering had been heard and would not be erased. Her mother wept quietly beside her, her lips moving in prayer, her shoulders shaking as years of strength finally gave way to grief. Lawson sat in the back, his face calm, his eyes steady, knowing this was not victory but closure, the promise he had made fulfilled. At the defense table, Harold did not move at first. His mouth opened as though to protest, but no words came. For the first time since his arrest, he did not reach for excuses, did not attempt to charm or to plead. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed, and when the guards rose to take him away, he stood slowly, shuffling forward like a man already half gone. The mask of the Catfish King was gone, stripped away by truth, leaving behind only a broken figure with nothing left to claim. When the session closed, the crowd poured into the sunlight outside, voices rising in a mix of anger, sorrow, and disbelief. Workers who had once depended on Harold confessed in low voices that they had seen signs but stayed quiet, ashamed of their silence. Neighbors admitted they had been fooled by donations, by smiles, by the comfort of believing a lie. The parish felt both lighter and heavier, lighter because truth had finally been spoken, heavier because of how long it had been ignored. Rachel stood on the courthouse steps, her mother's hand in hers, her tear-streaked face lifted to the sky. She whispered that Emily had not died in vain, that her courage had forced the world to see. Lawson stepped beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder, and said quietly, "Your sister gave us the truth. Because of her, he can never hide again." Rachel nodded through fresh tears, her grief still sharp, but tempered now by something steadier, the knowledge that Emily's voice had broken through. The courthouse emptied, the voices faded, but the story lingered in every corner of Baton Rouge. In diners and churches, in barns and porches, people spoke of Emily Carter, of the camera she had hidden, of the night the water in Pond 3 betrayed its secret. Harold Greene's name, once spoken with admiration, became a warning instead, a reminder of what silence can allow. And in that memory the parish carried forward not just grief, but resolve that never again would silence be allowed to bury the truth. Life teaches us through stories like Emily's that silence can be as dangerous as cruelty itself. Evil often thrives not only because of the actions of the wicked, but because of the quiet of those who look away. If this story touched your heart, I hope it reminds you that even the smallest act of courage can bring truth into the light. And perhaps, when you hear a cry for help in your own life, you'll choose to listen, to speak, and to stand for what is right. If you found meaning in this story, please remember to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and together we can make sure no truth is ever buried in silence again.